Here from City of Encinitas, the Wild Clean Water Department. This is a celebration of Pete Seeger today, and of course, if he were still alive, he would be 100 years old yesterday. Yesterday was his birthday. So we're going to sing Happy Birthday to Pete Seeger, okay? So now we can all sing Happy Birthday, so come on, we can all get into this, right? Is that a good key to be in? Happy birthday, right there. I think it'd be a good one right there. Are we ready? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Pete Seeger. Happy birthday to you. Nice idea. So Ross, you want to take over?
Sure. Did he show you anything?
I'll go.
Yeah, you can see me in this nice one. Thank you. I think our sound man is stuck in traffic. He'll be here shortly. Anyway, thank you guys so much for turning out today. Obviously, 45 minutes is not going to be anywhere near enough to talk about all the things we could talk about with Pete Seeger. I'm going to guess most of you at least have some awareness of Pete, but very few of us in this room, I think, have awareness of everything about Pete. Because as I've been putting this project together and working on it, I keep peeling back layers and peeling back layers and find more and find more. And I'm about convinced that there aren't too many more people that have had more influence on us as a society, as a culture, as a people, on so many different ways. Almost all under the surface, almost, right? Never commercially popular, except with the Weavers a little bit. But he was always there for 60 years. Check, 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 check. Well, nothing else. I know Peter Bolland has a loud voice, so that's all we fine. So anyway, we are very honored this afternoon to have two special guests to help us learn more about Pete. Check, check, check.
I think I found something. I'm not the sound guy.
Yeah, don't blame him. He's not the sound guy. Yes, my friend and partner Kevin, I have to take up for him because he's done a lot of really nice stuff for me, so I can't sit here and beg him. He'll be along in a second. But I think we can get started. I think everybody's here okay without any problem. I don't think mics are necessarily even that important. So, first of all, let me introduce a certainly very well-known and long-time San Diego folk singer. I don't guess pop singer. I mean, he was with a band. He's done the rock thing. He's done it all, right? But he's also a philosophy and religion professor. Yeah, they were trying to figure out which one I was introducing because everything I've said so far applies to both of them, right? So yeah. But anyway, I'm going to let Peter come up and introduce Jim. So please welcome to the stage a good friend of the library, Peter Bolland.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, there he is.
Got that mic going?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, things down there. I'll give us 30 seconds. We'll get this other mic.
Check the other mic down there. Check if that working?
Yeah, look at that. We got something. Thank you, man. Okay, we're good.
Well, okay, so we.
This one's still. All right, Jim, come on. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Bolland. Let me introduce you to my friend. This is Jim Hinton, folk singer, a singer-songwriter like I am. We're both just. That's how we got into this gig, just because we play music. But Jim and I are both teachers, and we crossed paths at Osher at San Diego State. And Jim is not only a folk singer, but a music ethnobiologist. I made up a new word.
Ethnobiologist.
He's a scholar of folk music. He teaches classes about the history of folk music. How did you get into that whole topic in the first place?
Well, I'm going to talk loud because the mic is
the mic on again?
Oh, you switched it. No, I basically got into doing this because of my wife Sherry, who was also A professor. Okay, good. That's easier. No, many years ago, when we were first, married and getting together, I would play music for Sherry, and I would play her Irish songs, and I would say, "This is where this song comes from. This is what it is about." And she said, after a while, she said, that's a pretty good approach. You could probably do classes with that. And so I started off doing like Irish folk music classes and just talking about the history, the culture behind the songs, because when I had gotten into it, I'm from Tucson originally, and La Mesa. I'm not an Irish person. But I got into playing these Irish songs. I wanted to know what they were about and where they came from. It was important to me.
Right.
So that's how I got started. Yeah.
So I also am one of those folk singers who talks for 5 minutes and then plays a 3-minute song, and then talks for 5 minutes and then plays a that's how it kind of grows, because we love the music so much. So I come at it from a little different place. I'm a professor of philosophy and humanities, as you heard Ross say. So I'm thinking always about the role of art in society and culture, and as someone who's just a passionate fan of all kinds of music, all genres. I've been reading deeply about Pete Seeger for a while now, and when I was invited to sit up here with Jim and kind of go through some of these bigger questions, I thought this would be a really worthwhile thing to investigate. Why Pete Seeger belongs on the Mount Rushmore of American music. And there are a million reasons, and we just want to explore that. So what we're doing is we're going to toss it back and forth along those lines, but we also want to do Q&A. So any questions or comments that are starting to take shape in your mind, we're going to definitely break the session up and leave a lot of room for that as well. So we're going to begin, though. I just want to kind of toss that big question to you to get it started. Why does Pete Seeger matter?
Well, Pete Seeger wound up being at the perfect place in the perfect time. In 20th century America, he was born in 1919, and there were political movements that were coming about at that time, the labor movement in the U.S. And his father, Charles Seeger, is considered one of the founding, originators of ethnomusicology. He was at UC Berkeley back in the early 1912, and then he actually, this is funny, he got chased out of Berkeley for being a pacifist.
During World War I.
During World War I,
popular, yeah.
And so, his first wife had been a classical violin player. And then they had a divorce, and then he married a classical composer. So very musically involved, but also culturally involved, because his dad picked up on this. And when they were kids, Pete and his brothers and sisters, they would go down to the southeastern United States.
Right.
And to me, this is so cool. They went down there, first of all, to bring culture to these people, and they wound up getting blown away by the culture that already existed down there.
Right.
And it's really intriguing, because not only Pete, but his stepbrother Mike went on to found a group called the New Lost City Ramblers, which, by the way, they were so good at what they did, it inspired Bob Dylan to take up songwriting, because he figured, I can't play as good as these guys can play, so I have to do something different. So we started writing songs. And his stepsister Peggy married a fellow named Ewan McCall from Britain, and became one of the foremost figures in British folk music. So no, there was a rich environment there, musical and cultural, that Pete grew up in.
Yeah, I was struck, and maybe many of you are too, who studied Pete Seeger's life, by this fascinating synthesis. Both of his parents come from the classical, academic, refined world of formal music. You know, Pete Seeger's maternal grandfather founded the Juilliard School, and his mother taught there. And his mother and father used to play parlor music at mansions in New York City. And so that's the kind of refined European classical, formal, intellectual, musical tradition that is part of Seeger's family. But then you have this other piece, because of his father's interest in musicology, and he was lured to Berkeley to start their musicology program. He's really a pioneer, Pete Seeger's father is. And then there's this whole other side where the social justice piece starts coming in. But I'm struck by almost the paradox between all of that formal kind of East Coast intellectual background and that really rootsy banjo playing, you know, singing Negro spirituals like We Shall Overcome. How did he, in his own mind, you think, bring together the power of music from that formal root with the folk music? Was it just his exposure to folk music in the archives, Willie Lomax and all that stuff?
No, I think it was the exposure to it, because anybody who has ever experienced sort of that roots music from the southeastern United States, in fact, there was a period of time, especially in the 1920s, when there was records that were made, 78s, that were very, very popular. They sold a lot. And I think when the Seeger family went down there and they heard the banjo players, and they heard the singers, and they heard the songs, it was so rich. It was so culturally vibrant. And at the same time, it worked in with the political labor movement of the time, because a lot of times when the labor organizers would go into the South, especially like with the miners, well, they would bring local musicians in to attract a crowd. And so this started to come together, the social justice part, along with the traditional music aspect of it. And it was just, I think, as it probably would have been for you or me, if we had heard this at the time, we would have gone, yeah.
So let's talk about Woody for a minute, because maybe Woody Guthrie is part of the answer to this question, right? Because he's been doing it before Pete. This highly political, highly socially active songwriting, not music to entertain, not music to sing about personal stories of love, but music to attack corporate America. You know, music to attack the industrial military war machine, music to attack those who exploit labor. And, you know, Woody Guthrie's famous phrase on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." Woody Guthrie intentionally used song as a political bullhorn. And how's that? Well, first, how did that affect Pete Seeger, do you think? Or maybe how are they a little bit different?
Well, here's an interesting little anecdote about the way that Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie came to know each other. Remember the actor Will Geer, Grandpa Walton?
Yeah.
Okay, so back in 1939, Will Geer was involved in raising funds for migrant farm workers. And there was like a rally in New York City, and that's where Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie came together. And I don't know that Woody knew of Pete, but Pete knew of Woody. And because see, the thing about Woody was, he also, he was really roots. He was writing the songs of the people, but he also he was on the radio too. In fact, a lot of people don't realize this, but Woody Guthrie was on the radio in San Diego back in the 1930s. There was a radio station down in Chula Vista. And that's one of the ways that he got to be known for his songs. And of course, Pete Seeger knew about him, and they started playing together, and Pete with his 5-string banjo could listen to and accompany Woody, who was a little bit idiosyncratic about the way that he played songs, right? And no, so they hit it off. There was symbiosis there that happened between the two of them that led to a group called the Almanac Singers.
So they had a band
They had, it was sort of a thing.
for a minute.
I listened to all of the recordings of the Almanac Singers, and they were just sort of like all of us. We got together and said, let's go to Peter's house. Bring your guitar, bring your banjo, we're gonna sing songs.
Yeah.
And they would just get together and they would sing. And they were very, very politically oriented. The union movement was a big, big part of it. And up to a certain point, sort of pacifist movement before World War II was a big, big part of it. And then they eventually, when they saw what was happening with Hitler in Germany, they switched over. And in fact, Pete actually went into the army.
Yeah.
He was,
Not a typical pacifist move.
well, the thing was, what the army did was they said, play your banjo. And so he entertained the troops, but no, it was coming together of so many things. I mean, it was culturally a return to traditional roots,
Yeah.
progressively, politically, a movement towards, union organizing
Right.
primarily, and very associated with the way the Communist Party was then. There's no two ways about that. I mean, communism, when I was a kid, became like a naughty word.
Right.
But back then, it was just a word, a movement that people who cared about people, and people who cared about workers, and people who cared about working conditions, and all those kinds of things rallied around.
Yeah, Pete Seeger has this really amazing history with communism. He joined the Communist Party officially when he was in his early 20s, and he stayed in about 6 years, but he retained a deep affinity with the communist perspective. As late as 1995, in an interview, he said, I'm still a communist, because communism is the closest political ideology to Christianity that I can find. And of course, he survived the McCarthy era by making some really difficult decisions about taking what he called taking the First Amendment, not taking the Fifth. He just basically said, it's my freedom of expression to keep all these. I'm not going to tell you who I voted for. I'm not going to tell you who any of my friends are. I'm not going to rat out all these friends. Because, of course, the band he was in, the Weavers, in 1950, got blacklisted in 1953. They had a red-hot 3-year career, #1 songs like Goodnight Irene, that were on the Billboard #1 position for like an entire year. And the Weavers were ruined by the McCarthyist blacklisting anti-communism scare. So that's when communism became a dirty word, and that's when his association with Woody Guthrie became a little bit more challenging as well. I read this recently, that in an interview, Pete Seeger said of Woody Guthrie, he said, I was kind of the East Coast intellectual. He was sort of a self-taught Oklahoma intellectual. And this is what he said also about Woody. Woody put all of his energy into never changing. And I put all of my energy into constantly trying to change. And it was an interesting position that sort of drove them apart. You mentioned in passing Bob Dylan. I want to bring him up too into this discussion. I also read that Pete Seeger was instrumental in bringing this unknown singer, Bob Dylan, to the A&R man at Atlantic Records and getting Dylan his first record deal. His career worked out pretty good after that. You probably heard about that. And so how are Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger kind of two different facets of the American folk renaissance of the mid-20th century?
No, it's an interesting story, because they basically were very much together at a certain point in time. When the Bob Dylan story is complex. He started as a rock singer in high school, trying to do Little Richard. Right, and then he went to the University of Minnesota and got introduced to the folk realm, and he embraced it and went after it. And as I was saying earlier, he was really trying to do the traditional thing. And Mike Seeger Pete's half brother, discouraged him from it because he looked at Mike Seeger and he said, I can't do this as good as he can do it. So Bob began writing songs. And early on, he was totally embraced by the Pete Seeger group. You know, the more traditional folkies. I mean, you know, Pete's, 22 years older than Bob Dylan.
Right.
So it was a different generation. When Bob was writing songs like Blowing in the Wind and A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall,
Masters of War.
Masters of War, these guys said, this is our guy. But you know, Bob was so young then, and he was still evolving. And that was just a step along the way to who he was going to become. So by the time he performed at the Newport Folk Festival in '63 and '64, by 1965, Dylan shows up at the Newport Folk Festival, and you know, Pete Seeger is sort of like the MC of the whole thing, and he's got this idea about this folk community, all you know, involved in social justice and everything else. And Bob Dylan shows up, and you know what? The #1 song in the country at the time was Like a Rolling Stone, which was not a traditional folk song, by the way. And so, but Bob wanted to represent himself, so he went on stage with an electric band. And I guess it was kind of a mess. I mean, I've talked to people who were there who said that it really wasn't as bad as people say it was.
It's become this legendary.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they did not know how to mix the sound that well.
Yeah.
And it was, and Pete got very upset. Now, to me, like the main thing is that we had a divergence here. What we called folk music before, by Pete Seeger's definition, was the music of community, was the music of involvement, everybody joining in. When Bob came along, it became individualistic. It was like it was his own kind of genius was beginning to emerge poetically and so forth. And it was an uneasy moment, is all we can say about it.
Yeah, and you know, one of the songs Dylan sang in that set was Maggie's Farm. You know, I ain't gonna work on Maggie's farm no more. And so that has kind of a folk sensibility about exploited labor or something. But when you think of Like a Rolling Stone and Positively 4th Street, those are songs those are deeply personal songs and angry songs directed against another individual. They had nothing to do with the genre of music that Seeger and Guthrie and the New Christie Minstrels and the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul and Mary were doing. It started, I think Dylan kicked down the door, and so when this young singer-songwriter called John Henry Duchendorf got a cut on a Peter, Paul and Mary album called Leavin' on a Jet Plane, John Denver, of course, and you all know this story, John Denver, and that Leavin' on a Jet Plane song was the most personal song and the biggest hit probably that Peter, Paul and Mary had. So that's a kind of Dylan-esque thing to start writing using the same acoustic guitar instruments to usher in what is my era, basically the 60s and 70s, the singer-songwriter era, the Laurel Canyon crew, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Peter Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, Jackson Browne, and all of the rest of that. I think that's all being born in those early Greenwich Village cafes.
Well, there was a very interesting transition. I remember, like, there's a clip from the 1964 Newport Folk Festival, and you know, if you've ever been to festivals, they have workshops, and it was a topical song workshop, and Pete Seeger was running it. And so Bob Dylan shows up for the workshop, and what does he sing? Mr. Tambourine Man. And you see Pete at the back of the stage, kind of with his head in his hands, going,
too many words.
This is something different is going on here.
There's a surrealistic poem. It's insane.
Yeah. And it really was a remarkable shift. And they're saying, like, with people like John Denver And after that, I mean, you know, Bob Dylan really changed the whole thing. He made it more personal. Whereas Pete Seeger was always communal. It was like, everybody join in. This is about all of us. And Bob Dylan said, no, sometimes, well, I think it was the psychologist Carl Rogers that said sometimes like the most personal is the most universal.
Right.
And Bob Dylan understood that. And so he went very, very personal. And it was a tough transition.
Yeah.
For the,
You know, John Lennon said in an interview that when they first met Dylan, they just broke into USA, you know, meet the Beatles, the Ed Sullivan Show, and all that stuff. And they're singing, yeah, 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 and I want to hold your hand. And, you know, when I saw her standing there, and they heard Dylan, they're like, holy cow, you can write about real things? And so in a way, the Beatles are yet another child of this Dylan moment that was a bit of a breakaway from that earlier folk music. But of course, the folk rock of the mid-'60s, you know, the Byrds had a huge hit with the Seeger song Turn, Turn, Turn in 1965. And the Byrds had huge hits with Dylan songs like Mr. Tambourine Man too. As long as you could, you know, Mr. Tambourine Man has like 6 verses and there's only 1.5 verses on the Byrds version, because you got to get it under 3 minutes, you know, to get on your AM radio. Remember AM radios, those little things?
yeah.
We're all of a certain age in here.
No, it's really true, and to me, like, it's kind of fascinating that there is still a link between what Pete Seeger was doing and what Bob Dylan did. Because I was of that era. To me, like, Pete was a little old for me.
Yeah.
Bob was my guy.
Right.
But you know, I remember like my first Pete Seeger album I had him singing Dylan songs on it. And you know, there was like a coming together there. It's a consciousness thing. It's not exactly topical.
Right.
It's just like, it's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of embracing the world. And it's a way of caring about people. And whether you take it from like a very more internal viewpoint, as Bob Dylan did, or a more communal viewpoint, as Pete Seeger did, there was a commonality there. And that's why we talk about them together.
Right, right. Well, I'm eager to hear from any of you who have a question or comment. I'll just sort of trail off with this last observation. I kind of wonder, I was talking to Mike Halloran the other day, the DJ in town, and we were talking about who's writing protest songs today. Where has that energy gone? That energy of resistance? Is it in pop culture anywhere at all, or is all pop culture about dancing and Friday night getting drunk, which has always been a part of music, of course. But why don't we open it up? And that's just a thought that I have kind of on my mind too. Let's leave some space here for any comments or questions. Just raise your hand and I'll point out, please.
You know, I grew up in the Dylan era. I feel it did have a lot of that. But I think as I got older, I started looking for the community music. And I've been finding that quite a bit around San Diego. So, you know, I do feel like that's the Pete Seeger style.
So,
singing.
So you are finding some of that Pete Seeger or folk energy in, you said community music?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? Yeah, so you're talking about
Song
circles, yeah. People's homes,
People's homes.
coffee houses, well, that's not happening so much anymore.
Bluegrass music brings in a lot of singing together and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, you know, because I kind of came into the business, strangely enough, through
Wait,
Irish.
it's a business?
Well, it was because I had to make some money. There were bills to pay. I ended up playing Irish music, and so I wound up being in the Irish pub scene for many years. And it was so Pete Seeger oriented in the terms. Everybody sang along with everything.
Yeah.
And, you know, you didn't even have to introduce the song or the chorus. Everybody knew it, and they would come in. And sometimes it was radical. A nation wants, you know, but that's what it was. It was community music, and you weren't up there to be a star, you know, to be the celebrity. you were just the guy sort of conducting
Yeah.
the community sing-along and responding to the, the wishes of the people, what they wanted to hear.
Yeah, there's something, I guess that's what the folk in folk music means, is that it's, as Pete Seeger would often describe it, it's democratized. His ideal show was everybody sitting in a circle, and you couldn't tell who the star was and who the audience was. And in a way, folk music for me is a throwback to a time before the invention of recording. Think of how the electronic technology of recorded music absolutely transformed our culture. Before the art of recording music was invented, the sales of songs was tracked by the sale of sheet music. So in 1910, you got a hit song by selling tons of copies of the written sheet music to your song. Because every house had a piano that could afford one. Every house had a guitar and a banjo and an auto harp, maybe even, at least. And so music was something you did with your friends and your family in every American home. And then think of how that's going to go away when radio and recorded music are invented. Now we sit and listen to professionals sing to us. And we've had music removed from our lives as an activity. And it feels like to me that folk music is a kind of kickback, a kind of response against that.
Well, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it's like, you think about communities back before we recorded music, and there'd be like a guy like you or a guy like me that be invited to parties and play. I think folk music has been our sort of attempt to hold on to that legacy in the face of this commercial, music scene that has gone on. And then, there's commercial folk music as well. Obviously we talked about the Kingston Trio and even the Weavers. I've talked to so many people from that generation that talk about hearing Irene Goodnight for the first time. And, it's hard to understand how great that impact was of, Pete Seeger and his group that, alongside Sinatra, who I love Sinatra as well, but here was something that sounded real. And it had, guitars and it had banjos and people who weren't necessarily polished singers.
Right.
And people really were drawn to it.
So you felt like you could do it too.
You felt like, okay, this is, in fact, I was talking to you on the phone about this story. This is like a big part of the Pete Seeger legacy, was that you can do it too. And there's a story about him after he had been blacklisted, and this is in the 1950s. And so he wasn't getting like the big concert venues anymore. He wasn't on the radio, he wasn't on television. But he was still out performing, and he went out to, I think it was Palo Alto High School. And at the time there were a couple of young sisters that lived in the neighborhood, Joan and Mimi Baez. And their aunt took them to see Pete Seeger. And so they went in and they listened to his presentation. And his message was basically, you can do this music yourself. It's there for you to do. And both those girls were just really inspired by that. And of course, the rest is history. Now, the other interesting part about this little gathering, and I'm not sure if it's exactly true, but the story, we don't care. The legends are made this way. At the same gathering, Pete was selling this little booklet he had on how to play the 5-string banjo. And there was a student from Stanford University named Dave Guard. Now, you might recognize that name because he was the founder of the Kingston Trio. And he picked up the book. And I guess he was a quick study, because if you listen to the early Kingston Trio albums when Dave Guard was with them,
It's pretty good.
he's pretty good. So this is what Pete brought to the community.
Right.
He inspired people to take it into their own lives and make it theirs,
Yeah.
and then share it from then on.
You had a comment?
Yes.
You were asking about, where maybe the protest songs and what happened to that.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert, I really don't know much about this, but I would venture to say that it turned into, it's been epitomized by rap music.
Yes.
And so the rappers are the people who have been expressing all their discontent with society and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The difference here, a major difference in that, is that you can't sing along. And then Pete Seeger,
Well, you and I
go to
can.
Pete Seeger concert, and everybody was singing.
Yeah.
He'd break the audience up into, the different groups. And, yeah, it was fabulous.
Now, I think this is an excellent point, though, that
The idea of people actually being able to sing the songs.
yeah.
Sing those songs, and put the words together and express themselves. You just don't have that with rap.
Well, it's a different kind of song structure. Rap and hip hop are essentially spoken word art forms. And it's about flow and rhythm and assonance and consonants and end rhymes and internal rhymes and using language as a beat instrument. And that's diametrically opposed to Irene Goodnight. Or Juan Tanamara, or whatever, So the two genres are quite different musically, but I like your point that I think a lot of what you and I call protest music now comes out of hip hop and rap culture, and it is a kind of folk music as it occurs to me. There is no more guitar music in pop music anymore. All the guitar players went to Nashville. And they are now all playing country music. And that's where all the bass players went, and that's where all the drummers went, because pop music is all guys with their laptops making beats. And I gotta tell you, because I teach at a community college, and my students are 19 to 24 years old, and every one of them has a laptop, and every one of them is a DJ, at least. And every one of them is making beats and writing rap. So this is the new kind of folk music. Now, they don't sit in a circle and push play. They upload, they stream, they sell CDs at their shows, they hand thumb drives to each other. And since the record industry has sort of collapsed, it's all DIY, it's all do-it-yourself. And that's a strange new iteration. And not all rap is about the same thing, but in that rap and hip-hop culture, there aren't people talking about social justice issues, about the rotten water in Flint, Michigan, about mass incarceration issues, about police brutality, about the so-called war on drugs. Obviously, these have been key topics in African American hip hop, particularly for 30 years, since Straight Outta Compton. So that's an interesting new form, and maybe that's where protest songs go. I tell you what, it's not happening in the hard rock world. They're still singing about dragons like Led Zeppelin. Yes. No, hang on just a second. We'll go here first, and then...
I'm sorry.
We're calling on different people.
I know.
We are terrible. We're sowing chaos. So
I've heard that Elizabeth Cott was domestic with the Seeger family. Picked up the guitar upside down when she was 8 or 12. Could you confirm how that kind of all went together?
Elizabeth Cotton is a remarkable story.
She was in San Diego here about 1976.
No, she played concerts around here. I regret that I never got to hear her live. But you think about songs like Freight Train. She wrote that song when she was a kid. Yeah. And she was just like a natural musician.
So what's your connection to Seeger?
Well, she just comes from that generation.
Oh, I thought you were saying...
She was a domestic for the family, and that she...
You know what? She may have been. I don't know that.
Let's start that rumor now.
No, the thing is, I know that she was a domestic for many, many years, and with all this musical talent. And then when the 60s folk revival came around, Elizabeth Cotton re-emerged, and people were just amazed because she was so skillful, a great guitar picker, songwriter, singer. No, I'm a big fan.
That's fascinating.
Yes. I don't know that she worked
You know, I don't know that.
We're learning that right now.
Yeah, we'll have to check that out. Yes.
Please.
Well, what I was thinking is, I mean, in the old world, it was always, regardless of you have radio or not, that if you came together, let's say, party or camping or year 10 over, then you started singing, you just fell into song.
Yep.
And that actually totally shocked me when I came over here, that people didn't sing. I mean, usually, if there's a party, there's a song or something. That was the big difference for me between Europe and here.
No, I understand like what you're saying, and that's why like my experience with the Irish community
Right. They
was
all-
so different because it was so natural. In fact, we would sit around sometimes. I remember like on Sunday nights, like the crowd would be less, and we would get in a song circle. We'd sit around in chairs and we'd go around and everybody sang something.
Wow.
Everybody sang a song, and they all knew songs, and they were all good. It was incredible because like they had just grown up with that tradition, like you're talking about.
Why is it not here so much?
Why is it not here so much? Yeah, I just don't know. It's, everything has a number of causes. It's not just one reason, is it?
Well, you know what?
Because we all saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. We're like, I can't do that. That's too great.
No, but I thought
I tried to do it. Yeah, and here we are.
Right, here we are. No, I mean, I think that the fact that, yeah, with the media and the recording industry and motion pictures and TV, they got to see people who were really, really skilled. And that's what you wanted to see. Now, the thing, at the same time, we all also had our little gatherings. I remember the whole time I was growing up, there was always people, someone at the piano, someone singing, someone playing a guitar.
I don't think that's ever going to change.
I don't think it's
completely.
going to change either.
You have to be in the right.
Yeah.
You have to be in the right circle, right?
Sherry.
Yeah, Pete Seeger wasn't the direct connection to Elizabeth Cotton. Elizabeth Cotton was a name for Mike Seeger, the math part of the family.
Okay.
Ah,
Okay.
very
There
good.
we go. Thank you.
Okay.
That's my wife, the professor.
Oh, fantastic! Let's see if we can squeeze another one in here. Please, sir.
There are still a number of open mics around Encinitas. I go to one every Monday night. We've got great accordion players, several people, singer-songwriters, guitar. Some of us sing Pete Seeger vintage music. And people are invited to come along and sing along if they want. So there are some, but it's not quite the same. No, this isn't a hike of your bills, actually.
No, there are open mics all over. It just occurs to me, every new song I write that's any good, I record a little video on my iPhone and I put it on my YouTube channel. And that's another way, and I don't get a lot of views, I'm not that guy, but I just do it to like archive it and put it up there so people can see it and they can look at it. That's another weird way that we use technology to build community. Please.
Yeah, Ross and I were at the Bell Camp, and we got to hear Arthur Guthrie.
Oh, good.
And he, just two short things. He shared about his father, that he was not allowed in the basement. But finally he snuck down there, and he said, didn't he say his father he loved all types of music, not just folk. And the other thing is, he played with Pete Seeger maybe, 1,000 times?
Well, they played a lot together.
Yeah,
There was a
and-
period of time there where Arlo and Pete.
And,
played
right, and
together.
not a lot of people know that, but the very cute thing is that people would always say before they go on stage, they'd be behind the curtain, and they say, what song are we going to play? And Arlo would say, they'd open with the same song. Well, how about we just do that same one? Oh, okay.
Nice.
We are going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but we can get another question or two real quick here.
An observation and then a question. The observation is when you were talking about Seeger's turn from fascism in the face of the reality of World War II. I'm reminded that, probably late in the 60s or maybe around 70, hearing him sing and doing a riff when he was singing Bring 'Em Home, and he threw in a line, there's one thing I must confess, I'm not really a pacifist. And I think, he was sending an important message that was kind of contrarian message for the time, that there are things worth fighting for.
Yeah.
And then the question I would ask in response to your question about where are the successors, could I nominate Rhiannon Giddens as someone who is carrying on that tradition of going back to roots of folk music and social justice?
Can you say that name again?
Rhiannon Giddens.
Okay, got it.
Carolina chocolate drops.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that's, one of the things that attracts me to Pete Seeger on the political side is his willingness to evolve. Because in the early years of World War II, there was a kind of pacifism there regarding, let me back up. He even wrote a song about how bad Adolf Hitler was and how we needed to go and beat him up. And even though I don't agree with the government, let's take care of that, and then we'll come back and fix all the things that we disagree about. But he later kind of apologized for his pro-USSR positions. And he said, I wish I'd known more about what Stalin was really like. I didn't know. I just thought he was an effective leader. I wish I'd known what the gulags were like when I went to the USSR in the 80s. I wish I'd asked them, where are the gulags? But nobody, so he admits that he had a kind of a rosy picture of what communism was. But he spent the whole rest of his life being very clear about his position about that totalitarian regime being a really terrible example of how collectivism ought to work. So I thought that was really striking.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, he evolved. He wasn't the only one who, I mean, there were a lot of idealists back during the 1930s and the 1940s that identified themselves as communists.
Yeah.
And, we did not know about Stalin until later. It wasn't until the early 1950s that we actually heard about the legacy of Stalin. And I know a lot of people, especially like, in the folk community, had sort of championed that.
Yeah.
And it was a rude awakening.
Right. No, and all you had for information in 1930 was the local newspaper. And today we have so much more global access to information and media sources. So, well, I guess we do need to kind of wrap up, and that's our time. So thanks for joining us for this.
Thank you very much.
At 2:30, the music starts. Thanks, everybody.
I want to thank Peter and Jim. Just a couple of quick things real quick. Anytime the subject is communism and these folks come up, I always like to point out Ronald Reagan went to some Communist Party organization meetings. It was a different time. Okay? I just wanted to finish that again. I can't thank these guys enough. Peter's been such a great friend to us, and Jim also over the years. I haven't seen him in 3 or 4 years. Doing these things and nothing else is great. Just get to see old friends again. I want to finish up with a story that probably all of you know, but in case there's one person that doesn't. It's a story I heard. I think I'm blessed with a very good voice. It's a story that someone told me when we were beginning this project, and every meeting we've had along the way with the staff and partners, I told them to kind of inspire them. And again, you probably know the story, but it's when Pete was playing over in Spain in the 50s, and Franco was still in the house. And Pete shows up to play in front of like 100,000 people, because Pete was absolutely international. He was known around the world. And a government official walks up and hands Pete a piece of paper and says, "You are not allowed to sing any of these songs." He looked at the sheet of paper and realized it was basically his set list for the night. He grabs his banjo, he walks out on stage. You can just picture that little spotlight, 100,000 people. He said, "Your government has given me this paper and said I cannot sing these songs, but it doesn't say anything about you singing." And he played the entire concert on his banjo as everyone sang all the songs. That is Pete Seeger.